Okay, great. So it's good to have you back,
Thanks. Yeah,
Connor.
it's good to be
So
back.
I'm very happy to see you working on the metaphors, the visuals, so to speak,
Yeah.
of eruption theory. And
Mhm.
so one comment that I had for you while I was thinking about your work is that um, it's not just eruption theory actually that fits into the pictures that you're developing about, looking for the ripples of the mind, this kind of
Mhm.
metaphor. There's
Mhm.
also Kleiner who has this idea of dynamical relevance, right? So,
Mhm.
consciousness should make a difference, and therefore, if it is dynamically relevant in the sense of, making a difference to the equations that run the system, the brain or the computer, whatever it is, then that system can be deterministic. The states can be
Mhm.
predefined from the beginning.
Mhm.
So if you had, the set of laws and the initial states, then, everything would be entailed from that initial get-go. Well, then there's no more room for consciousness to make a difference, down the line. So
Mhm.
it doesn't specify exactly what that dynamical relevance would look like, but the idea goes in the same direction. It's a little bit what we call the participation criterion, in other words.
Mhm.
And another one is Sarah Walker's work. So I just finished going through her book, and I find a lot of overlap. So to the way in which she thinks about consciousness as
Mhm.
making a difference to existence in a way. She puts it in very broad terms, but that's the idea, right? So it brings things into existence that wouldn't otherwise happen. And
Mhm.
you know, and eruption theory is a very specific way of trying to specify what those differences are that are being made. But I think it's quite
Mhm.
nice to see that there's a few, different strands from different backgrounds coming together and really like raising the bar on what we want out of a theory of consciousness. So I don't know,
Mhm.
it's just, it actually adds to your essay to kind of like say, there's a few different people looking at this in a
Mhm.
similar way.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Because does Sarah Walker comes at the kind of like that's assembly theory,
Hmm.
correct? Like this
Yeah.
kind of idea of like quantifying the complexity of biological systems as a way of kind of determining the difference between abiotic materials and biological materials. Is
Right.
that
Yeah.
that's kind of
Yeah.
that?
So there assembly theory is a part of this.
Yes.
But I don't think it's like the only way to make sense of the criteria that she sets out for a theory of life or a theory of consciousness. So I
Mhm.
think, the general idea is quite intuitive in the sense that, if you have conscious beings, then, in their environment, you will find things that you wouldn't otherwise find, and they can be quite
Mhm.
complicated, and they might have a
Mhm.
relatively detailed step-by-step procedure that needs to be done in order to get them into existence in the first place, right? I
Mhm.
imagine, what number of steps, are required to build a large hadron collider or something like that, right? So
Mhm. Mhm.
and you wouldn't have that if you wouldn't have conscious beings who have
Mhm.
certain goals that basically guide those steps. So it kind of makes sense from that point of view. But I think we can probably be a bit more specific about the way in which these alternative or otherwise counterfactually absent possibilities, how they show up, right? So that's something
Mhm.
that I don't see so much develop in assembly theory. But in
Mhm.
a way, if the idea is that, things have a certain trajectory and then there are counterfactual possibilities and life and consciousness basically make the counterfactual the actual, then from the point of view of what was actual before, those new actuals are non-derivable, and they basically seem to come out of nowhere. And that's very close
Mhm.
then to thinking about eruption, actually. That's the kind of we're looking at it at a very micro level in terms of, let's say, brain state dynamics or something like that. But the general
Mhm.
principle seems very close that if you're saying we want something measurable, well, there's a surprise step, basically. The trajectories would have led up to believe that this was going to be the next thing, but hey, suddenly there's this completely different object or, operation or something like
Mhm.
that that's happening.
Mhm. One of the things I kind of wanted to ask you about, I guess, was uh, is about eruptions being this kind of almost explosion of variance at the neurological
Right.
level. But there is still almost something constrained about that in the sense that
Yeah.
they can only erupt into the physical substrates
Right.
of the brain. So there is
Right.
still this kind of like constrained medium
Yeah.
into which this like creative process can happen.
That's right. Yeah. So there
Yeah.
must be some kind of conditions that need to be in
Yeah.
place. And we already said with the dynamical relevance that determinism can't be the case. It would rule
Hmm.
out eruptions by definition in a way. And we
Hmm.
have a postdoc in our group, Mark James, who always tells me the same thing that you just tell me now and says like, but you should think about these as constrained eruptions somehow, as contextualized in a certain way. And I think that's true, but I wonder whether that's definitional or whether that's just like step two in a way, right? So
Hmm.
yes, there is a location, event in space and time where the eruption occurs. And that very, very first step, by definition should be arbitrary. And, it should not be dependent on what already exists at that point in time. Um, but then how that unfolds is totally context dependent. Like what are the constraints that were at play? What's the organization of the system around it? And all of that. But that's not really what's being injected into the system. That the system brings that, to the table. And yeah, and so maybe if eruptions were to happen, in the middle of nowhere, like the air behind me suddenly has a tiny eruption event, if such a thing would be possible, it would just be totally, without consequence. It would just be, absorbed into the general fluctuations of air molecules. So, I think we talked about this last time. So it's not for nothing that organisms can be characterized as operating in a critical regime, at criticality, because that's exactly the kind of organization that you need in order to scale up minuscule differences to macroscopic consequences. And so maybe that is, one of those conditions that you need to have in place for eruptions to actually, do the work that they can do in a living being.
Yeah. Did you when I sent you the recent version of the essay,
Hmm.
um, I get to a point where I talk about that recent Michael Levin paper
Hmm.
on the classical sorting algorithm
Right.
paper and the sort of emergent behavior happening kind of outside of the sort of programming
Hmm.
of how these algorithms can function
Hmm.
or how we would expect them to function and solve the sort of goals that they have. Yeah, I guess my question is like, what do we what would eruptions look like in physical substrates that unconventional physical substrates
Hmm.
that if we're wanting to try to ask this question of do these do algorithms could complex algorithms exhibit any form of agency?
Hmm.
What would be the sort of signpost of that
Hmm.
type of agency?
Yeah, I remember that
Um,
discussion in your essay. So maybe that was one of the points where I was maybe not entirely convinced about the argument. So,
yes.
and maybe there's a difference there between me and Mike Levin that it's worth further exploring. But, in
Yes.
a sense, if it is a deterministic algorithm, talking about it being able to change its trajectory or something like that is purely metaphorical, as far as I understand. So,
Hmm.
um, if you have a deterministic dynamical system, each trajectory is unique and pre-specified from the get-go, and you can't jump from one trajectory to another, right? So when we talk about the system doing something different, it is actually just still on the same trajectory that it started on from the beginning. There's nothing, that made it change path in a way. That it's still always on the same path by definition. And so metaphorically, of course, we can say, well, it looks like it changed its behavior, and that's interesting. But maybe some of those principles are better thought of as some of the external scaffolding that agency can draw on, but that don't really express agency per se. There's maybe a subtle
Hmm.
distinction, but In a way, it shows us how much can already be done by purely deterministic systems. And then,
Mhm.
the flexibility just goes up if you remove then that, restriction and allow for unexpected events to take place. Yeah, so
Mhm.
the way in which we have a little manuscript under review, our group right now, where we try to cast a spotlight on indeterminism in large language models precisely for this reason, and say maybe this is not just a technical issue. What if this is actually an ontological issue? The status of the system just got transformed from a closed, functionally complete, potentially deterministic system where every trajectory could be infinitely repeatable because it's just a kind of platonic virtual algorithm in a way, to something that's much more lifelike, and that is open-ended. It can't be, the trajectories can't be repeated and so on and so forth. So it would be a signature of agency. And that doesn't mean that they are agents, but just let's say that it can't be ruled out as simple anymore. If the large
Mhm.
language models are deterministic and in principle completely repeatable and things like that, then on this view they cannot be agents. Not in a strong
Mhm.
sense, only in a metaphorical sense. But it
Mhm.
seems
Yeah.
like this easy easy answer to the question of are they agentic or not is no longer possible in the current leading edge of these kinds of models.
Mhm. Um, yeah, interesting. What there was, yeah, there was something that I was because I guess like when I guess when I say seemingly deterministic,
Hmm.
right? Like in the sense that like you say, it seems like the architecture, like we have an idea of the architecture of these large language models,
Hmm.
but there's kind of an opaqueness to how they arrive at the
Hmm.
sort of outputs that they do. And
Hmm.
I guess there was just something about that uh, opaqueness and the sort of the framework of the black box kind of framework that you use in eruption
Right.
theory that there seemed to be some kind of
That's
overlap
true.
there.
Yep. Yeah, so that's very important. And that's also your black hole metaphor and a few other things that you
Mhm.
basically play with these ideas of different forms of opaqueness that we're kind
Mhm.
of already familiar with in order to warm,
Mhm.
the reader up to the opaqueness that it means to have a mind operating inside
Mhm.
of a physical body.
Mhm.
Yeah, so then the question really becomes, is this opaqueness something intrinsic to the system, or is it just relative to our ignorance, right?
Mhm.
And different systems will give you different answers with respect to that. So just
Mhm.
having something that is opaque to us because it's too complicated to understand and full is not going to be, good enough. It might have very
Mhm.
lifelike properties, right? So a typical practice in artificial life is to just add a random number simulator somewhere in your system. So then it will, in a narrow sense, will not be a deterministic dynamical systems anymore because you've got this external variable that's injecting some unpredictability into the behavior. But in a larger picture, it's still deterministic because you can just,
Mhm.
reset it with the same random number generator at the same seed, and it will do exactly the same thing. So what looked surprising before turns out to be completely predictable the second time around. So,
Mhm.
um,
That to
but
me
yeah,
seems to
yeah, go
be,
ahead. Mhm.
sorry, just that distinction between, I guess, like, yeah, the functionality of having
Mhm.
like noisy sort of search processes in a
Mhm.
system versus it actually having like agentic qualities or
Right.
sort of, yeah.
Yeah, but these are
Mm,
very,
yeah.
that you putting your finger on another important point, which is to say that, in the traditional free will debate, randomness was always seen as a kind of reductio ad absurdum. Like, it means that you're just not answering the question properly. Like, how can we be free? Well, we should be controlling, the path of our behavior as if you're like operating a robot or something like that. And if the alternative is that the only way it can show up is, by being random, well, then that's useless, right? It can't do any
Mm,
real
mm,
work. So that we can already, remove that option. But it's not true.
Mm,
As you just mentioned, there are
mm,
actually many algorithms that benefit from injection of noise and actually make them more flexible and, finding better global optima. And, things like simulated annealing where, even in, when steam engines and things like that, where the technology of the day, like just changing the amount of heat in the system back and forth, allowing for harder steel to emerge and things like that. So that's kind of like artificial eruptions, in a way,
mm,
being
mm, mm,
injected into the material, and then overall you get out a better product in the end. And it's a
yeah,
very,
mm,
very concrete illustration that depending on what kind of system you work with, once in a while increasing the noise actually has, long-term beneficial consequences.
mm. Yeah, I guess that's in the essay of in a couple of points I've had to try to distinguish the character of eruptions from, say, just like the functional noise of brain activity.
Hmm.
Um, and doing so in terms of, I guess, like the timing
Hmm.
of eruptions co-occurring with moments of mental effort, I suppose,
Right.
is kind
Yeah.
of broad. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
that's going to be a tough one to sort out in practice. Ideally, we would want to divide the noise into different sources of where it's coming from, right? So part of it will be due to our own ignorance because we don't have, perfect resolution recording. So there will be some
mm,
unexpected things happening just because we're not recording all the variables. But like we said, that's
mm,
not what we're looking for, right? That cannot
mm,
do any work in the system. It will have consequences for our behavior of how we relate to the system, but not for the system itself, right? So that's totally an
mm,
observer relative notion of uncertainty. So we don't want that.
mm,
And then it could still be that you get noise from completely understood, well, completely, relatively understood processes of energy dissipation arising, through the system doing different kinds of work, whether that's, sending an action potential down the axon or, producing neurotransmitters or just feeding, the metabolism of the cells in the brain and things like that. So there will be, dissipation, noise will have, and entropy will be generated through those kind of more mechanical, mechanistic processes. Then the question is, are there also spontaneous changes that cannot be accounted for by either of these two other categories? And those would be the candidates to say, well, nothing rules these out. The universe is open to spontaneous fluctuations. But does it turn out that, when these are become very concentrated, that turns out to be correlated with you making an effort to achieve something, for example? And that
mhm,
would be the ideal situation if we could sort out, these different sources of noise and then
mm,
try to correlate this extra term with something, some kind of agential effort.
mm. Yeah, it seems like that it's going that way though, to like that there is this kind of bottlenecking of um, neuroscientific research to associate these bursts of neural entropy with
Hmm.
um, kind of yeah contexts of mental effort.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
it's interesting, I guess, like how historic, I guess, like these related concepts of like mental causation and free will, how conversations around free will have often the context is around like making a binary choice
Hmm.
or something like you're given this thing and you decide when to press a button
Hmm.
just of your own volition. But those being quite bad examples of when to measure whether our like conscious experience is having an effect on our behavior, because these are quite just like they're moments when they don't actually require much mental effort. It's
That's
quite just
true.
like this
Right.
automatic motor process.
That's
And
right.
so it's off, I've often had when I've been discussing these ideas with people, it's like it's the conversation is often framed around this like moment of like making this choice. But whereas the context when mental effort might actually be making a difference
Hmm.
is in these quite different scenarios.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so one of the things we're playing with is to actually go into these data sets and look at them a bit more carefully. There's um, uh, one data set that also looked at I said a couple now that we come across where people look at deliberative decision making versus this kind of arbitrary decision making that you just talk about. So trying to keep it as minimal as possible, but then actually modulating the amount of, how much is at stake in making the decision, right? Because in the classic Libet experiment, there's nothing at stake. And
Mm.
so in a way, it's a very unusual, framing, as you say, because usually we do things for a reason and not completely arbitrarily, right? So it's probably like the least ecologically valid way of trying to understand what agency is about. Um,
Mm.
yeah, so but this is the kind of thing that, what we will be looking for is that, as there's more at stake in your decision making, I still have to press this one button, but imagine that you're the president of the United States and that button is the red button and has like, huge consequences in the world, right? Compared to being in the Libet experiment of saying, the only consequence of me pressing this button right now is that it will be like, a data point in the data set that they're recording, and that nothing else is at stake here. Um, so we expect that as the level of, mental involvement goes up, we will find an increase in stochastic fluctuations in the neural activity, where those fluctuations basically are just a signature of the mind at work in a way. So so you can think of this as a normative dimension, right? So like every time you add a new dimension of consideration, is this gonna like, increase or decrease my monetary rewards? Is it gonna increase or decrease whether the experimenters like me or not as a friend? And is it, sufficiently different from before so that I feel good about myself and that I'm not just, imitating what I just did the last try? I don't know. You can imagine like there's so many different ways in which you can evaluate, what you should be doing. And for each of those, if it makes a difference for the timing of your behavior, then that's a difference that cannot be reduced to the purely physiological inertia of your nervous system, right?
Mhm.
Because going back to the fact value gap and so on, this is where eruption theory comes from. But if there's something at stake, it by definition is not something that can be described in purely physical terms, because purely physical terms are just facts of the matter. They're just pure events. They don't have any value associated with them, right? And so again, so to the extent that there's a value associated with your decision, with your behavior, then that's something that will be, not be captured by a purely quantitative account at the level of the physiology. So basically, there will be an error term, right? So you could try to fit the deterministic dynamical system to the neural activity, but there will be an error term of that activity which you can't capture using that kind of model, and that error term would grow with respect to how much value is at play in your decision making. And you're right.
Yeah,
So
there was.
it feels like this is already kind of, what people find, right? So, cognitive effort, motor effort, all kinds of effort are associated with increased entropy production in the brain, increased neural entropy, increased metabolism, right? If you think about fMRI, both signals and so on. And so it's already standard practice in a way to use both thermodynamic measures and information theoretic measures of entropy as signatures of mental work. And I guess the only kind of conceptual, twist here is that what eruption theory would hold is that this is not, reducible to mechanical work. But there will be basically spontaneous fluctuations, which appear like they're uncaused in a way, which is why they're spontaneous. But they only appear that way because we can't directly, observe through the material medium the values that are at play.
Yeah, I think this kind of gets at part of the argument that I was making, or that I'm trying to make in the essay, is that how say these information theoretic notions of entropy have classically been applied to the brain, let's say in like integrated information theory,
Hmm.
uh, and it say gets combined with this measure of causal integration to define phi, and then that is sort of almost as equivalent to consciousness.
Hmm.
It will paint, and so it is in a way, like you say, the mental value space is like collapsed into a physical description at
That's right.
at
Yeah.
some
So it's an
level.
identity theory. I think they say that explicitly
Yeah.
somewhere, right? So it's not just
Okay. Yeah.
equivalent. Consciousness
It
is integrated
is
information. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Um, and right. So it's still using this physical description of the brain and essentially saying like that is consciousness, and so you're sort of jumping that ontological gap between experience and physical description.
Right. Yeah. No, you
But
put your
it's
finger on
it's
an important point. So when now Tsuchiya was visiting us, we talked about this quite a bit. It feels to me that they would do better if they don't have this identity claim between consciousness and integrated information. Because otherwise, you basically open the door to a new kind of reductionism. Someone could come
mhm,
along, and people have actually come along and said, I really like your measure of integrated information. It's super useful as a measure of complexity, but I don't really care about, all your consciousness stuff. So I'm just going to use this complexity part and apply it to all kinds of systems. And then it turns out to be a really useful, mathematical tool. But that's possible. That kind of dissociation is possible because of the identity claim. Because basically, identity means that consciousness doesn't make any difference in its own right. It only makes a difference through, the causal integrated, whatever they call it, intrinsic causal, structure.
mm,
So by making that identity claim, they outsource the difference made by consciousness to this other structure. And then you can always
mhm,
say, well, why not just stay with that structure?
mhm,
And that's the problem. And the nice thing about eruption theory is that it introduces a kind of structural twist. So instead of identity or correspondence or equivalence, it's kind of like more like a transaction. So
mm,
when you make a concerted effort and focus all your mental energy on enacting one intention. So I have all these possibilities that I could be doing, but I intend one specific action right now. And when I do that, on the level of the neural dynamics, we actually have the opposite thing happening. We have an increase in variability. Suddenly, there's a kind of like fluidity in the neural dynamics that wasn't there before. There's an uncertainty goes up and so on. But so because these are kind of opposite tendencies, in one case, I have a concentration of mental attention and effort and intention. And in the other case, I have a kind of like, bracketing of existing constraints and a loosening of the dynamics. These things cannot be easily directly identified. These are actually like, opposing, dynamical tendencies, if you want.
mm,
But that then actually prevents a kind of overly simplified identification or reduction between these two processes.
mm,
And so, but it goes against a long tradition in cognitive neuroscience and the science of consciousness to look for structural isomorphism, right? So usually the search for the neural correlates of consciousness or for mental representations is looking for things that look similar, right? So I have a spatial experience, therefore I must have a spatial map in my brain. You know, uh,
right.
Ideally, if I see Jennifer Aniston visually, then I should see Jennifer Aniston in the neural activity imprinted somewhere, right? So, that's where it started. People really looked
Mm,
for the content of experience as somehow being represented literally in the brain.
mm,
And things
mhm,
are not that, direct anymore. But still, there is this general sense that a mechanistic explanation of how the mind works should try to find out how we're kind of like experiencing at the personal level, and then find the equivalent mechanism at the subpersonal level. And
mm,
and that I think is misguided. I think that
mm,
doesn't do justice to the brain, and it doesn't do justice to our experience. And yeah, and so the relationship needs to be rethought between these two domains.
mm, mm. Yeah, I guess I just like that this information theoretic notion of entropy can also be framed as signifying a hidden
Hmm.
factor,
Right.
but because it is specifically talking about the uncertainty or unpredictability of
That's true.
a measurement, you can also frame it as being a signature of something outside of the system influencing
That's
the
yeah,
system.
that's exactly right. Yeah. And that's that the nice thing is again that also it brings some fresh wind into debates about entropy and so on. And about uncertainty and the role of uncertainty in nature and so on. So there's a whole, let's say larger context of, should we try to find a way of describing quantum mechanics in a way that doesn't involve probabilities, for example, or stochastic, collapse and so on. Should our ambition be to have a fully deterministic picture of nature, or is that actually maybe misguided? So there, if cognitive science can say some things in that direction and say, look, if you ever want to have physics of the observer and how they fit into the universe, then you cannot, try to close the box such that they could never make a difference. And so that rules out, some interpretations and opens it to other directions. And yeah, so basically, although Shannon information often is interpreted in a observer relative way, as like your uncertainty with respect to the system. Another way of looking at it is that no, there's a hidden aspect, something that is not intelligible within the constraints that we can measure, and that's the beauty of eruption theory, really, that it just says like, well, why don't we just listen to what nature is telling us? We've tried for, I don't know, a couple of, since Descartes, I guess, but maybe more in modern neuroscience for I don't know, the last 50 years or something like that. We've tried to, um, decode everything at the level of the brain, and the mind-body problem is still here. The hard problem of consciousness is still here, very much alive. And with the rise of large language models, again, interest in consciousness is on the rise and so on, but we don't have any good answers on how to cross that gap. The explanatory gap is there still with us. So, but why not just work with it? Like it does, sure, yeah, we don't understand how these things are related, but we can quantify uncertainty, right? So that's okay. I mean, that's not the end of science, that we can work with that. And yeah, maybe it means that we can play God and like understand how everything fits together, but maybe quantum physics already taught us that that was not really gonna happen anyway. And that was like, a century ago when we started realizing that. So yeah, I really think that the a lot of progress could be made in cognitive neuroscience and maybe in biology more generally if we just accept that there are some things that make a difference but that are not directly measurable. And it seems like that's common practice in science anyway. As you also point out, there are many, cases in physics where we just have very indirect evidence for things making a difference, through, dark matter, changing the gravitational curvatures, or the curvature of geometry, space-time geometry around it. And so we know there's something there, even though we can't observe it. Okay, great. Yeah. So, the same is true for consciousness. We can't directly measure it, but, our entire life role is based on the assumption that it actually makes a difference, right? So just put these two things together.
Yeah, yeah, it seems strange that we're sort of quite happy or readily willing to invoke, these hidden variables into our sort of physical models of the world, but when it comes to like ourselves and conscious experience, like the thing that seems the most obvious, that we're kind of like hesitant
Yeah, yeah. So,
to.
so in that case, suddenly, everything is just there, what we can see, what we can touch, what we can measure, right? It's quite interesting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it makes sense that we started there, like, we work with what was directly observable, what's directly measurable. Like, if you open up a brain, well, you see there's the mass of the brain. Now we have more sophisticated tools. We can measure, like, what the neurons are doing and so on. But at some point, given that there's these intractable issues of trying to identify all of mental life with those properties, yeah, I mean, there are other options that we can pursue. But
Mm,
maybe one of the things that has been blocking us a little bit is actually the lack of, intuitive visuals of how to think about this. And so I quite
mhm,
like the fact that the way in which you're engaging with eruption theory is to try to find out, what are the most compelling images that we could give a general reader to kind of get a sense for what the idea here is. And so like, the ripples,
mhm,
you had like this nice image of a storm and
mhm.
then you have activity, like the black hole within us and things like that. It's quite dramatic
Mhm.
as as an
Yeah.
image. But there's something to it because even at the personal level, we're kind of opaque, and at some level,
Yes.
right? So we're not totally self-transparent to our own motives and where our thoughts come from and so on. And most of the time we're fine with that, but sometimes you do wonder, like, where did that, idea come from? Or, why was I thinking
Mhm.
that weird thing? So, yeah, I mean, even there's a certain opaqueness at play, and maybe it's uncomfortable to accept that on some level. I mean, we'd like to be, knowing ourselves more, and to learn that there might be some limits to that is, yeah, it's a little bit of an existential thing. It's not maybe physics has the advantage of that everything is external, it doesn't touch
Mhm.
ourselves. So
Mhm.
maybe it was easier to introduce black boxes than when it comes to human beings.
Yeah. 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 I mean, like, yeah, there's a nice middle ground here, I think, that like we want to kind of like we want to build our we want to build our view on like solid foundations, and like we want these problems to be approachable from the perspective of science in
Hmm.
some way, but we also have to kind of like reconcile with this kind of fundamental mystery,
Hmm.
and kind of be honest with ourselves. And I feel like not just when we do these things like equate experience to just reduce them to levels of physical description, we kind of like suck a little bit of the sort of mystery and magic out of like
Hmm.
what it is, the sort of absurdity of what it is to be
Yeah, yeah. So like,
alive.
why is there
Yeah,
something rather than nothing, right? Why is it there's
yeah.
something to be something rather than nothing? All of this.
Mm,
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's another kind of broader topic that we can touch on that also I had some thoughts on when I was reading your essay. It's like we do have to be careful not to fall back into some kind of traditional substance dualism, right? So it's a
mhm,
strange balancing act. You pointed at it right now, right? So we want to bring the
mhm,
scientific perspective. We want to make these problems scientifically tractable, using the most cutting edge methods and information theory and so on. But at the same time, we're pointing to limits of what can be done, and then trying to characterize, and maybe quantify exactly, how much we can know as exactly the complement for what you call the mysteries, which is like the qualitative aspects of our experience. Um, but in a way, I always think that perhaps it's strategically, we should try to avoid making this a distinction between mental and physical. I don't know exactly what the
mhm,
best words here are, but in a way, if we treat consciousness as a black box, as variables that are, efficacious and make a measurable difference, but that are not directly observable, then it just becomes part of physics. I mean, like, it
mhm,
is not
mhm, mhm,
somewhere else. It is
mhm,
just in nature. And we can
mhm,
actually measure the consequences of it. And, the only thing that is a bit odd about the situation is that the phenomenon doesn't show up to our instruments in the way that an object would. Well, okay,
mhm,
but that's fine because other phenomena also don't show up directly to our instruments. And it also has this weird thing that it cannot be directly expressed in the standard physical quantities in terms of the units that they usually have, let's say mass or energy or something like that. But that's also okay because we also know that there are quantities which are unitless, even for non-conscious phenomena. So again, it's um, on the one hand, really getting serious about non-reductionism sounds like we're moving into the direction of dualism. On the other hand, it feels like this is exactly what is allowing us to be much more physicalist about dealing with the phenomenon. It's a funny kind
Mhm.
of paradoxical twist to the story that to really
Totally.
make it measurable and quantifiable and see how it fits into the rest of what we know about the body, we have to take in non-reductionism seriously. Um, and on the other hand, just want to like the flip side of this is so if you try to protect physics from, let's say, consciousness making a difference, and say, with Kim, there's the causal closure of the universe and so on. Therefore, mental causation and so on can't be, a kind of top-down, constraint or something like that. If consciousness is not allowed to make any difference, that really sounds like non-scientific or weird or
Hmm.
dualist, right? So that would mean that we have this phenomenon that we can relate to, and that seems to exist. So there's something that's like to be me and you and everybody, and yet it makes absolutely no difference to anything else. Now, that would be a huge
Hmm.
exception to everything else that we know about how nature works. Because if something exists, it makes a difference somehow. Otherwise, we would
Hmm.
basically, be tempted to eradicate it and say, actually, given that we posited this, but it has absolutely no difference for anything else, probably it's not actually existing. And that's the story of the science of consciousness, right? So you always have someone saying, okay, well, there's this consciousness thing, I define it this way, and then someone will say, well, actually, given that it makes no difference, why should I buy your theory? I might as well just be an illimitivist and just, continue studying the brain without worrying about those things. So it's like really turning this around and saying that, the idea that you should try to get an account of consciousness that doesn't interact physically, in order to be more naturalist or something like that, is precisely the wrong move, I would say. It's we need to go the other way. We need to show that it makes a difference, in ways that, would be recognizable by a physicist.
Yeah, like to me that approach would even makes the fact of our experience even stranger, like even more mysterious, in that if you can't square it with the sort of physical and chemical laws of the universe, then yeah, like what, why,
Well, yeah, exactly.
why?
So that's the hard problem of consciousness, right? That's the
Yeah.
zombie philosopher
Mm,
zombie
mm,
argument, right?
mm,
And that seems just extravagant and
mm,
puzzling, and that's why there's the meta problem of consciousness. Like, why do we even find consciousness to be a problem in the first place of this specific
mm.
sort? But yeah, I mean, if
Um,
it turned out that your experience would be absolutely useless, it would be a very strange universe to be in. Yeah.
one one of the I think the ways that we yeah that you can kind of like help to maybe break down this like dualistic like falling into this like potentially dualistic trap is thinking about like, and then maybe we spoke about this a little bit last time, was like examples of like minimal cognition and like basic physical systems that we might not even consider to
Mhm.
be living, and that if these concepts like memory or learning or decision making are emergent in these really, really rudimentary physical systems,
Mhm.
then then it is built into the sort of fabric of nature,
Mhm.
and our own minds and experiences are part of this like lineage of sort of systems that have progressively gotten more elaborate.
Mhm.
But then we just it's not like just one day suddenly consciousness sort of emerged after a sufficient point of complexity or something. It's
Right.
something that is actually like
Yeah.
built into the potentiality of systems all the
Right.
way down to really, really simple physical substrates.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I might even go further these days than I did for most of my career. So you always thought that, the origin of life was still a kind of categorical decision point between purely matters of fact pure events and then normative conditions, like some things are better and worse. And that's already a big help, right? So if you want to understand consciousness, if you're basically assuming zombie, 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 zombie for 4 billion years and then bam, humans, that's a
Mm.
tough thing to explain, right?
Mhm.
So just to kind of assume that with the origin of life, there was already some things that were better and some things that were worse, and it's not, we shouldn't think of this as, a little person sitting inside, that single cell, or whatever it was, and, thinking about whether to go up the sugar gradient or something like that. Um, but just a kind of like, very, very almost like autopilot, sense or felt quality of, maybe this is the better direction than this other direction. Um, but just, the sense that there is a direction is already, something that goes beyond pure matters or fact. And so, but now the question is that, can we go one step even before that, to before the origins of life? And at the very least, going back to something we discussed before, the conditions in the rest of the universe need to be such that they are amenable to eruptions and normative directions being able to make a difference to behavior. So that means, all the layers below need to be open in order to receive these unexpected, spontaneous changes and things like that. So but whether they themselves also already carry some qualitative direction is something that
Mm.
is hard to think about. But there's one
Mm.
indication that I'm playing with a little bit at the moment, which is actually a couple of things. There's the direction of time, which seems to, have the feeling of a normative thing. So why this direction and not that direction, or why not back and forth, and why flow at all. And then also, given that a lot of physics, is agnostic to where in the kind of trajectories the current now is, why this moment and not another moment? Um, and so it could be that these kinds of processes of selection, which are not determined by the laws of physics themselves, already carry within themselves a little bit of what we might want to call a privileged direction or a privileged moment of time and so on. Privileged here meaning that there is a kind of very weak sense of normativity involved. This is the right time. This is the right time for the universe to exist now and not at some other point in time. And this, what it means to be the right moment, of course, who knows? But if we think about it that way, then there could be a kind of, cosmological, proto-normativity, which is already at play and which has exactly the same characteristics of what we find later, which is that it's invisible through what we can say about the physics of the universe. So, there's nothing in the laws of physics that would say why now is now and why the direction of time goes that way and not the other way and so on. But that's again, there are things happening here which are not intelligible from what we can observe and measure, but which are evidently having some kind of effect on what's happening. So yeah, there's a whole nother project to kind of like work out a little bit that parallel, but it's quite fascinating because it would make it a kind of nested story that starting from very, very generic, very broad, I'm going to collapse, the symmetry this way rather than that way, to, yeah, I'm going to be alive and I choose to preserve my life rather than just let go and decay and back into the environment to, human decision making. It might be one kind of trajectory that adds more and more specificity to things that were already at play even from the beginning.
Mm. Yeah, fast. Yeah, I guess when you say that, I guess it makes me think about like the when we talk about maybe like the adaptive role of what consciousness or the mind is doing in terms of uh, facilitating these eruptions.
Mhm.
It's kind of like it seems like it's very like a concerned with inflating the space of possibility
Mhm.
in the here and now, like
Correct.
what
Yeah.
we can do in the present moment.
That's a
Whereas
nice way
like
of putting it. Yeah, I like that. And that brings us back to Sarah Walker's view on this too, that somehow consciousness is that which, brings more counterfactuals into actuality, something like that, she puts it. Um, and that's kind of cool, like it's definitely an acceleration of, capacities that were there before, but now they're much more expanded. Um, and yeah, and it allows us to think in a new way of why are we here
Mhm.
on this planet in the first place? Do we have a purpose in
Mhm.
this or not?
Mhm.
And to think about the possibility that our awareness actually allows the universe to do things that it otherwise couldn't be able to do. That's kind of interesting.
Mhm.
And from that point of view, actually, I'm t like, maybe AI is going to facilitate that even more, right? So right now, a lot of
Mhm.
what we do with our consciousness is kind of mundane in the sense that, we need to take care of feeding the population. We need to take care of, building the infrastructure, of protecting people, of, making sure that people don't get sick, and, of distributing information properly and so on, which have a very constrained scope of what can be done there. And they're very kind of mechanistic in a way. And a lot of that has been automated, but not all of it. And with the coming of AI, there is a possibility to envision, like in the long term run, that maybe a lot of these processes can be automated. And then what's the point of people in that world, right? But
Mhm.
what
Mhm.
actually the AI could do is allow us to dedicate ourselves completely to realizing counterfactuals, like to actually
Mhm.
just spend our, cultivate consciousness in such a way that we allow it to bring novelty into the universe that otherwise wouldn't arise. And
Mhm.
that means, maybe art, music, aesthetics, good
Mhm.
literature, I don't know,
Mhm.
dancing, like I
Mhm.
take this example from when I was in Mexico. So, for some indigenous communities, the whole point of people is to help dance the universe into existence. That's a
Mhm.
very
Mhm.
beautiful way of thinking about our role here. And it's exactly this kind of counterfactual. Like if people wouldn't be here, then nobody would be dancing, right? So
Mhm. Mhm.
that comes with a certain culture, with a certain aesthetic, with a certain amount of creativity, and people will
Mhm.
dress up and so on. And
Mhm.
for them, that has cosmological significance. It's not just something that they do for fun, but because they feel like that's what the universe needs in a way, or that's how they fit
Mhm.
into the universe. And
Mhm.
it would be interesting if somehow we can recover some of that way, like broader way of appreciating our role in the universe.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes me kind of think about like like this thing maybe AI doesn't work as like a concrete example of this, but it maybe as an analogy. It's did did we create the intelligence of AI, invent that intelligence, or did we kind of facilitate the process for this kind of latent intelligence to then emerge and then have
Mhm.
like to have its embodiment and have causal efficacy and
Mhm.
these things. Like even if maybe AI isn't that now, it could
Mhm.
be in the future,
Mhm.
or we might be able to create the capacity for us to expand our embodied intelligence to allow for new forms of mind to emerge from, what is
I
possible.
love it.
I
Yeah,
don't
there's
know,
so many angles to this question. It
yeah,
keeps
yeah,
going.
yeah. But I,
Let's have another chat about maybe with that. I think, I could use a brainstorming session to think through that, carefully and just systematically unpack the
yes,
different angles to this. But
yeah, yeah,
in general, I resonate with the direction in which you're going here. So, even already for our own bodies, maybe this is what I can say now, and then also I have to wrap it up because I have another meeting coming up. But even for our own body, our intelligence, according to eruption theory, is not directly under our control. And
hmm
it's like with the simulated annealing example, right? So we can inject temperature to increase the temperature for a moment, and then let the metal cool down, and it becomes a stronger metal. But that consolidation process is not something that we directly do. That's the metal itself arranging itself again into a better, more coordinated, material. It's the same with our body and with intelligence. So what we can do is loosen up the dynamics, the constraints once in a while, and then the system settle down. And by doing that repeatedly, it becomes attuned to the affordances better.
Mhm.
But ultimately, exactly which action crystallizes out of the confluence of our brain, our body, the environment, and so on, is something that, depends on our capacities, our history of interaction, depends on the affordances of the environment. It's not something that we can directly select and say, this is the action I want to do. And so in that
Mhm.
sense, our own intelligence is already a little bit like the intelligence that you're describing here, which is that,
Mhm.
our bodies and our environments, we're cultivating them such that we display intelligent behavior in a way that's aligned with our intentions and with our environment. But that's kind of like a spontaneous process ultimately. It's not something that we do directly. And
Mhm.
so there's a kind of intention action gap, but most of the time we don't notice it because we're so well attuned with our bodies and our environments. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, so basically taking that analogy then and applying it to this technology, it seems like it's an amplification of this process,
Mhm.
where again
Mhm.
we're basically setting the conditions for the emergence of an intelligence, which then, and we don't even really fully understand how, does the right thing most of the time, right? It's not just giving us, statistically correct, sequences of letters, but actually meaningful responses or meaningful to us responses to the prompts that we give it. Now, how does it do
Mhm.
that? And that speaks to this kind of notion of alignment that
Mhm.
something about the emergent process is such that spontaneously there's a kind of resonance, a matching between the intentions and the kind of behavior coming out of the system. So there's much more
Mhm.
to explore there. And
Mhm. Mhm.
I think that's, we're just at the beginning of that conversation, I think. But that's
Totally.
exciting, very much.
Yeah.
I think that, maybe
Yeah.
changing the way we view the mind also helps us to better
Mhm.
understand what's going on with AI.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, cool. Yeah. Yeah, happy to let you go. I might just, if you don't mind, as I continue to kind of refine this essay, if you don't mind me to keep sending you versions and don't feel like you have to like
Yeah,
give
no,
me
of
this
course.
in-depth
Please do.
feedback and stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah, just because eruption theory is still kind of like sitting quite central to the sort of thesis of the piece, it just yeah helps to hear what you have to say about it. So yeah,
Yeah, no, and
thanks for
I
joining.
very much, enjoy trying to find new ways of expressing these ideas, and trying to find
Mhm.
some nice images for it. So I
Mhm.
do appreciate your work on that. So we'll be in
Cool.
touch.
Great,
All
great.
right.
Thanks, Tom.
Take care, Connor.
Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers. See ya.